Welcome to God with George Ortega and Joshua Bond. This is episode number 22, recording it on Monday, November 16th at 3:13 p.m. Eastern Time. We're talking about God, most specifically relating to God, but really, our thoughts about God, our thoughts about what God does, what God doesn't do. This is a very important conversation. Josh, wait a minute. This is difficult. All right, we're not conditioned. We're not trained by our religions, by society to do this. In religions, for example, they tell you to read a prayer that somebody else has composed, which is a very, very different experience than talking with God. And so, again, it's very important to talk to God because that's how we get much, much closer to God.
Yeah, so this technique of talking to God, this is really, I don't know if we shared with the audience this, but this is how we actually started out the series, or you actually started out this whole series, was with this, profound breakthrough that you had, this kind of rejuvenation. I'll let you describe it. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but, this experience that you had, you and I had been, you know, um, meeting together, almost daily for many weeks, talking about God and, how we understand God, which is usually through religion, and my past experiences with religion and God, and that didn't include all aspects of God, which includes these illusions, right? And so through that, I was hoping, I was living vicariously through you, explaining and talking about your experience and these amazing breakthroughs and life changes you were having that happened as a result of this, that led to this show, right? And it was so powerful and spoke to me so much. And so maybe you want to share some of that with the audience.
Um, Interesting, Larry. God had me at the last 10 seconds you were saying that, right? God had me before that, kind of like remembering that the point that I wanted to make was to talk about how important it is to talk with God, because then I didn't hear the last few words you said. But anyway, the point that I wanted to make, and I want to make now, is that basically we rely on ourselves, to do everything. And a lot of times we just can't do these things without God. So that's why it's important to bring God into whatever it is we're trying to do.
Yeah, and that's, interesting going back to that, kind of combining both those things that you and I are talking about is, I was a missionary. I started off as a missionary, after I did engineering for a while, early on in college. And then I started looking at other religions and other sciences and different things, right? And then I ended up back on this track of, after I tried to explain everything scientifically and even looked at kind of religions that aren't necessarily such hardcore religions like Buddhism, right? Then I ended up back on this track of reaching out to you because you were such an authority and a powerhouse of information, knowledge, and community building on this illusion aspect, and saying we need to understand God in this perspective, bring this awareness to the religions that God is causality and God is everything.
Yeah, as you were talking, I was thinking that we all do this whenever we're talking about what we do, what other people do. It's like, I was doing this, and and then the other people are doing this. And what I'm trying to say is, we may want to change our grammar. And you and I were talking about this before, just the idea to rather than saying, well, I was doing this, well, God, had me doing this, and then God had me doing that, and God had me wondering and questioning. Now, it's not something that we can just shift our consciousness so that we could automatically just begin to phrase our descriptions of what we do in that way. But I think that would be a very powerful strategy for being much more conscious about God's role in everything we do.
Yeah, George, this idea of changing our language and our syntax is so powerful, right? Because what happens is the ego identifies as I am this, I'm choosing to do this, I am identifying myself as this, right? And that's such nonsense in one perspective, because that is not how the world works. That's not what how biology works, and we're biological beings. Or even neuroscience disproves all this, right? And there's been many great thinkers, Anton Wilson, a philosopher, he did this little experiment, and every time he used the word I in an egoic way, he would, beat himself or slap himself to try to stop himself. And, that's really kind of a metaphor for what we need to do to be more connected with God and the reality that God is everything, is everywhere, and that includes in all of our cells and us as a causal agent.
As God had you saying what you were saying, God had me thinking that it probably would be an excellent idea for researchers to basically instruct subjects in an experiment to describe whatever they're describing. They may need a little practice, whatever, to describe what they're doing in terms of, well, God made me do this and God made me think that. And then, through an EEG or functional MRI, some kind of imaging technology, then record their brain activity during this different kind of relating. Um, it may be that there's more coherence. It may be that to the brain, this is a truer way to explain things that again might be detectable on imaging. But yeah, it'd be a good experiment, I think.
Yeah, George, right along those lines, let's talk. I want to talk about briefly, about this concept of mental illness or mental disorder, right? That is effectively the new false religion of science. It's in the early stages of understanding, so let's give them some grace, but it's very pejorative, right? And it's kind of nonsensical because it doesn't understand causality, doesn't understand this aspect of God, doesn't understand, so much of these aspects. And really what's happening is our consciousness is a responding to whatever the stimuli in the environment is in a way that either we're judging it and we're condemning it, or somebody else is condemning it and labeling it as wrong or bad or even sin or evil, right? And that's so silly. That's not how the world works. We wouldn't do that with any other aspect of life. We wouldn't do that if we're growing plants or raising animals, whatever it is, right? And so I think the audience needs to embrace some grace with this.
Yeah, and all right, what you were, I mean, the way you described this is like you made it seem as like it's like the fault of psychiatry, the medical professional, which in a sense, I mean, that's how this happens. That things that aren't, let's say, illness or defined as illness or whatever. But again, what basically, again, this is we need to practice doing this. God had you. Omit God from that. God had you kind of like just express it as if God was not, making the medical profession act in that way. And what happens is when we express, information like that, bringing God into the picture, then it raises questions like, well, to us, it doesn't seem like it's wise. Why did God do this? And we might completely agree with it. But again, like to bring God into every kind of consideration that we have.
Yeah, George, that's powerful. So God is everything, right? And another, and some it might help people to get this, to think in other terms, synonyms for God that we often use, right? So, you know, God is essentially this form of spirituality and this wholeness that we have, right? And so to realize when any institution doesn't have, spiritual wholeness, right? It doesn't consider the whole biopsychosocial spiritual being and the biopsychosocial sociological spiritual concepts of society that we're all a part of and our mind is influenced by, then things get out of balance. And it should be our goal to kind of restore this and kind of be loving and accepting and embracing of all forms of consciousness, right? And even all mistakes and all troubles and all even contentious arguments, essentially, to love and embrace them.
Yeah, you raise an excellent point. In other words, like we shouldn't just conceive of God as everything and all powerful, all knowing. I think we should, it's very important to conceive of God as love, as happiness, so that when we're feeling love, when we're feeling happiness, we recognize and appreciate that we're feeling God. You know, we identify God with these feelings that we value most in life. And the stronger the connection we make to God, you know, when we're feeling happy and loving and all, I think that's probably going to make it easier for us to love ourselves and everyone else. Because like basically if we're defining God as everything, then you know our mind will reason it out and say, well, yes, if I'm loving other people, I'm loving God, I'm loving myself. You know, it just creates more love by bringing God into it.
Yeah, George. Another synonym, two more synonyms for God might be um, ineffable, things we don't have a words for, can't express, right? And also this transcendent value in that, right? Not transcendent in the sense that God isn't material. God is everything, includes material, but through these ineffable experiences, right? So think of a normal idea of a church or a worship service, right? We might talk about God a little bit, even as we're doing now, right? People watching this might be having these transcendent, information downloads, emotional downloads, just like they would in a huge church service. That's emotional, but we can't necessarily articulate it in the simple language that we have as these kind of talking monkeys, right? And so God is this expansive, transcendent, all loving, all powerful concept.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you hear the idea of God being ineffable, but I think, you know, like how you were explaining it um, subsequently, I'm not sure it's God that is ineffable. I think it's the experiences, the emotional experiences, the spiritual experiences we have communing with God that we don't have words for, you know, and because I think, you know, like, you know, when I think like, you know, again, God is like all powerful, all good, all loving, whatever. So like I think we have ways to describe God, but I'm not sure. You know, I think we really need much more evolution, more development in identifying what it is when we're communing with God, when we're feeling these feelings, having these experiences that are connected to the reality of God.
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head. So, our understanding of God is evolving. We're effectively getting smarter in understanding and being able to talk about God. And the ineffable part is this inability that we haven't developed yet. Just like we think of in science, science hasn't figured it all out yet, right? So we call it that metaphysics usually, right? And maybe science can't prove all metaphysics. We don't know yet. But consciousness is evolving, language is evolving, even religion is evolving to be able to express and explain and be able to facilitate these experiences that we can't quite yet explain, but we have, and they're very real and they're very profound and they're very transcendent, transformative, and make us better people that are able to love ourselves, love each other, be more moral, and be more happy, right? And be able to talk about that. As it evolves, we can express it better, and each generation adds to the knowledge base of the previous generation to do that.
Yeah, I think one way you're right. You're saying, you know, in a sense, our religions today do not allow us to evolve in our understanding of God and our relationship to God as much as we're capable of. You know, in other words, like they churches, synagogues, mosques, they don't talk enough about like, you know, trying to understand what God is, what our relationship with is to God, you know, to find words for these feelings we have, these experiences. And that is perhaps, you know, one way that we need to change, change our institutions so that our institutions, our religious institutions in this case, just help us to evolve more quickly, to have a stronger, more accurate understanding of God and our relationship to God.
Yeah, George. I mean, this is America, right? This is a melting pot. We have more churches per capita, more versions, varieties of churches per capita than any other country in the world, probably, right? But the mosques, the synagogues, the temples, it's, very much still based on the scarcity mindset of a control mechanism, right? And we're struggling with it. There's pros and cons of it, but we should be seeking all of these spiritual
next door to like the greatest outdoor park in the world, the greatest recreational.
where you can experience nature, but not going to do it because you felt that you should only experience nature in one version, right? And this is silly. And we need to expand our consciousness, expand our awareness of what God is, and embrace all of these insights to a relationship with God.
Right now, all right, because I didn't grammatically, syntax wise present that, as accurately as I could have, we might find ourselves blaming religions, blaming churches, synagogues, mosques for not getting this right. And so like, yeah, to the extent that, and so, or so, yeah, so that's one part of it, that basically, again, to the extent that we attribute what we do to God, we're not distracted by blaming agents rather than just attributing true responsibility to the author. The second thing that comes to mind is like, again, this is a question we'll ask over and over. Why does God have us do this? Why does God have us make these mistakes or not see things in the correct way every moment of every day?
Yeah, I really appreciate that kind of metacognition you had, right? And this is speaks to this evolution of consciousness where we shouldn't condemn, certainly any spiritual leader, any religious leader even, right? We might disagree with certain things they say, but that doesn't mean we should condemn them or their organization or their model, right? And really realize that we're evolving consciousness and reality to understand how we can better experience a larger variety of things, a larger variety of God in the world in different types that we normally haven't experienced to, while still maintaining a cohesive community, a social community of support, right? A congregation or whatever it may be, right? And this is essentially this, two-part expansion of consciousness that God is evolving us into an understanding of God and all of causality and reality.
Yeah, I've talked to God many times. There was a time, maybe about 3 weeks ago, a month ago, where I was talking with God and it felt different. It felt like I was really talking with God as if I'm talking with a person who's right there. It just lasted, 10, 15 seconds, 20 seconds. But, that it happened once. And I'm sure, many people have had that experience. So this is something we want to think about. Like, how did that experience come about? How do we replicate it? How can we, understand our relationship to God, our communication with God well enough so that when we're talking with God, we always feel that strong connection rather than it just being an abstract practice.
Wow, George, what came to mind is this parallel concept, right? This idea of talking to God in different ways is almost similar to this exploring different religions or versions of God, right? And so, like this, the leader of this synagogue is very much kind of synonymous with the ego in our head, or this rigid ideal of God we have. They're wanting to grow us spiritually. Our true self is wanting to grow us spiritually, but we have all these concerns, right? And so this is where this aspect of God, of expansive causality, expansive reality, expansive access to truth, wisdom, and understanding and transcendence, that we don't have in ourselves, that the traditional religions may not have all of, right? But together, I think this is the phase change that we're going through as a species, right, with the internet and everything else, to access this greater knowledge base of what God is.
It's very important, if you were raised Christian or Jewish or Islamic or Buddhist or Hindu or whatever, that you explore the ideas of other religions, because like God told, for example, with Buddhism, God stresses the idea of the non-self. And if you not no personal self, right? So like, and that's something that Christianity and Judaism at least don't emphasize at all. But with Buddhism, if you understand that concept of no personal self, then you understand that your consciousness is God's consciousness. God is working through you. So that's just one example of many that, God didn't give the complete, total truth to any one religion. It seems like God spread it out to different religions, different philosophies. And it's good to get the best understanding of God, to be aware of these ideas.
Yeah, and in case the audience hadn't catch our previous episodes and doesn't understand a lot about Eastern religions, so essentially my view, and this may be oversimplified, is Hinduism started out very genuine, just like I believe Judaism did, and they both remain very genuine and authentic. But what happened is they developed all these laws and rituals, right? And so in Judaism, Jesus came along. In Hinduism, Buddha came along and said, let's distill it down to something more simple. Let's look at what consciousness is. Let's address these issues of the illusion of free will. Buddha very much did this. Jesus was probably in a scene, which was the sect of Judaism that focused on the illusions and the causality of human will, right? And I think we're due for another rendition of that, right? This understanding of grace, causality, and God that speaks to this illusional awareness.
Yeah, I want to explain the utility of the many, many rules and rituals, at least in Judaism. I think in other religions they have them. Basically, when I was Orthodox, I was practicing Orthodox Judaism in the 80s, right? And you have to say a blessing before everything. You cross a doorway, there's a mezuzah there, you got to kiss the mezuzah. Every time you drink something, you tie your shoes, you say blessing. So, I mean, like, the idea is that, like, when you're doing that, you know, anytime you're doing something, you're either thinking of God, because of the blessing, or wondering if, like, should there be a blessing for this? And it's a very, it can be difficult to, like, get accustomed to if you're starting from a different tradition or whatever, but, like, it can be extremely effective in keeping one very connected with God. So, like, I just wanted to make that point. I mean, it's not that we want to give up all the tradition also.
Yeah, certainly, George. And this is where the idea of metacognition really comes in powerfully, right? So we all, even in a non-religious, non-God context, we struggle with habits or addictions. We struggle to make good habits, break bad habits, or whatever it is. We're addicted to TV or whatever it is, right? And all this is, right, is our biological propensity to have relationship with some certain form of stimuli, right? Something in the environment or some way somebody is that makes us mad, right? Or we're addicted to, or whatever it is, right? And so religion has always been this technology, developing this technology, these techniques of repeating the same thing over and over again, meditation, whatever it is. And it has to be a personal relationship. Does it work for you? And if the religion is saying, well, even if it doesn't work for you, then that just means you're wrong because it does work, then maybe find a different religion or whatever. But that's really what it's all about from my perspective.
Yeah, another point, like with the laws, the rituals, like, you say blessing, whatever. Laws are kind of like, they're really an attempt to help us better understand the difference between right and wrong. There are laws, and basically it's the idea behind the laws. And sometimes, for example, the idea behind religion is to help us become happier, right? But sometimes we get caught in the details of religion and we forget that it's about making us happier and about connecting us closer to God. So I think, with the rituals, with the laws, with the other kinds of concepts, I think, Josh, I think what you were saying, yes, it's very important to understand the intent of religion. And again, that is to make us better people and closer to God.
Yeah, George. And I mean, the first step is for me, my understanding now is if the religion's not working for me, don't just give up on the religion or the laws or the ritual, whatever it is. Try to deepen the relationship with the self and with God as causality over your actions and thoughts to understand why it's not working for me, right? Before we go seeking something else, right? And most of the time or a lot of the time you end up having to seek something else, but it's kind of spiritual bypassing, right? To just be offended because it's not working or insulted or scared or whatever, and just go seek out a different answer. And this applies to even psychology, even personal relationships, even marriage, right? Because all of these wisdom traditions want wholeness. They want the best for human individuals, and they might not understand everything, right? But they've been developed over many thousands of years, and they are essentially God in the form of causality and wisdom.
All right, and it's important to understand, to remember that yes, there are many traditions of religion and philosophy that we can learn about God through, but a more direct means that may be more effective, I think there's value in both, is seeking this knowledge directly from God. The more we talk with God, the more we acknowledge that God is the only being, that we're all, again, puppets, we're just like manifesting God's will, the better we understand religion, ourselves, God, our entire reality. So again, I think that, sometimes like much of what we want to know is not being taught by religion. So yes, in these cases, we ask God. Okay, Joshua, close the show.
Yeah, George, this has been really fun. This we've been trying to go back and forth for a minute to see how I interact, I respond to what you said, and then you interact and respond to what I said. And this is essentially God playing out our relationship to understand, how does this work for us, right? Just like the audience can do, right? They may not time limit their conversations, their relationships, their reality to 1 minute intervals, but ultimately pretend like you're doing that to be able to dissolve the ego, dissolve the reaction, the negative reactions that we are conditioned to have, to see this causality, to have this relationship with God, and then ask God, why is it happening? How can I understand it? And how can I make it better? Right. And I think this is what we will continue to explore through this series. And, it's really been profound in my own life, even. And I hope